Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Joe Powers, the principal of Jones College Prep. Thank you all for joining us on this Town Hall Series Budget 101 program. Our presentation is to provide you with some school budget fundamentals, how things work in CPS and how things work in Jones, so that you'll understand what we're doing moving forward with our fiscal year 22 budget. Next slide, please. If you would like to submit a question, you can use the form that is there on your screen. There's a QR code as well as a link that is indicated there by a red arrow. So you can submit those questions and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. If we are not able to, we may assemble some of those as FAQs and put those out for everybody to see through our website. Give that a moment for people to see. Very good. Okay. We'll start with some where the money comes from, essentially. School funds come from multiple sources. Now, we're not talking about the tax systems and that sort of thing. Instead, we're talking about once CPS and the state has funds, how are they allocated to the schools? First of all, and the largest single grouping of funds that come to us are from the school district. They're from CPS, and that's from our student-based budgeting program. Those are on our budget line 115. We'll talk more about that very shortly. We also receive funds directly from the state of Illinois, actually through CPS. Those also are on our 115 funds. And some funds come to us directly or indirectly from federal sources, also on our 115 line. Our other incomes include school fees. That's the 124 line. 124 is our internal accounts. That's student activity fees and others that we'll talk about shortly. School rentals and leases, which we'll be talking about that as well. And gifts and grants, such as grants from Friends of Jones and other donors. Now, coming to the things that are the most important sources of income. Our student-based budgeting, or SBB, line 115, each school receives an annual allocation based on the school's projected enrollment. And this is something that's a bit of a misunderstanding on the part of some people. CPS provides every school with the same per pupil dollar amount for general education students. The per pupil amount for this next fiscal year is $5,958.58, a very specific figure. And the Jones budget is based on an enrollment projection of 1,970. That's approximately the same as it was this time or in the fall this school year. So we're looking at a fairly topped out enrollment. We'll talk more about enrollment as we go along. And then finally, other SBB or student-based budget funds, those amounts that are provided for our cluster programs in special education, diverse learners. Those program funds are calculated on a different basis, and they receive direct federal funding. Next slide, please. We also receive state supplemental aid, or SA, also goes on line 115 of our budget from the state of Illinois. And this amount is a per pupil amount based on the number of students who qualify what used to be called free and reduced lunch that we now refer to as fee waivers through the completion of the family income information form. The per pupil amount for the next fiscal year coming from state supplemental aid is $990 per pupil. We also received this year, and this is unique for fiscal year 22, additional school discretionary allocations. Now, these are allocations that are going out to all the schools in CPS in different categories for us to address school level issues and the effects of the COVID pandemic and the long closure that we had. These will include funds to help us meet students' social and emotional needs related to the closures and the pandemic and transition back to in-person learning, addressing accelerated learning needs, and a per pupil allocation for this is $125. But I will caution you that this is apparently for this next school year only. There's not any firm idea of how this will continue past that. There may be some additional funds for the next fiscal year, but this is for next school year only at this time. Pardon me if my voice is a little hoarse, I apologize. We do have income from other sources, as I've mentioned. We have student activity fees, academic fees, depending on classes that students sign up for, athletic fees, rentals, and leases, grants and gifts. And these are funds that are managed in our internal accounts. Start first with student fees, because this is something that goes out to every family as we start the school year during registration. Student activity fee, there is one single fee here. This is for all students that covers a wide range of costs that impact all students across all departments. For example, it includes such things as expenses for each department, for consumables and other supplies for the classes. It covers the cost of yearbooks for all students, a lot of printing, paper, testing costs, assessment costs, student newspaper, for example, and postage and mailings. So there's just a few of the things that are covered by the student activity fee. We also have rentals and leases. The rentals, we're very blessed as a school. We're in a wonderful location. We have leases and rentals for various activities from outside groups. Unfortunately, and that's a significant income for our school and is extremely important as part of our overall budgeting. Unfortunately, since March of 2020, we have had no income as a result of the pandemic. And we are waiting to find out from CPS when that might restart during the next fiscal year. When it does restart, it will be a slow process of various people, various organizations recontracting with us, such as several churches that meet at our school building and so forth. And that will take a while to ramp up during the following school year. But the leases and rentals for Jones are a very important part of our budgeting. Now, we also receive a number of grants and gifts during the course of the year. Jones is very blessed with our outstanding Friends of Jones organization, which has supplied for many years grants for classroom and school-wide type of activities and needs. FOJ grants make it possible for us to devote a larger portion of our annual budget to support staffing and other basic needs. So in other words, things that we might not be able to budget for that support our students and their activities and their learning can come from grants from Friends of Jones. Teachers can submit grants, clubs and organizations can submit grants, and so forth. Jones also occasionally receives donations from private sources in the form of matching funds and gifts. For example, several years ago, we received 3 grants totaling $150,000 from Rivers Casino, and that was to support our student opportunity scholarships. We have students who are unable to pay tuition for the dual credit for Loyola University, and these gifts and grants, such as the ones we received several years ago, and other internal account resources help us to pay the tuition for students who qualify for fee waivers for our Loyola University dual credit program. So it's a great opportunity for our students and a great asset. Now, how do we allocate our resources? Once we receive our budgets and we look at our internal accounts and where they stand each year, all student-based budgets and supplemental appropriations budgets, SA funds, are encumbered, meaning they're already earmarked to cover staffing costs. That includes salaries and benefits. Positions that cannot be covered by these funds are funded from internal accounts, our 124 funds. And again, as I've mentioned, those come from a number of different sources. A number of positions are funded centrally. In other words, they're not part of the Jones budget. For example, the principal, 1 clerk, and 1 counselor are provided for every school in CPS. Our diverse learner teachers and the paraprofessionals that support those programs, that is also covered by the ODLSS office, which is a CPS central office. Our food service, custodians, engineers, and security also are not part of the Jones budget. However, overtime for some of those, especially in the area of our engineers and our custodians and security. That overtime does need to come from Jones budgeting. And we need that sometimes for various events beyond the regular school day and the regular hours. We also have each year developed department and program budgets. And these are based on, come from our internal accounts, and that is largely paid for through student fees. These budgets are based on the typical needs of a department or a program and adjusted as needed to meet changing needs. For a number of years, as our programs were growing and we were expanding the number of courses we were teaching, we were able to keep up with that through the growth of our student enrollment. Now we are kind of stabilized. We are very stabilized in terms of our enrollment numbers, and the expansion of our programs has pretty well leveled off. We make changes, obviously, we grow and add things as needed, but the large growth that we experienced from 2013 onward, when we added the South building, that of course came to an end, and we have now leveled off as a school. We're looking at, as I said, an enrollment of about 1,970 students as we head into the next school year. So we make those department budgets based on their typical needs and the way the teachers in those departments communicate with us what they need for their school year coming up. Now, Jones has always and will always face challenges. All schools do in terms of their budgeting. Resources are never unlimited by any means. And our student-based budgeting, which has worked extremely well for Jones, does provide us with a set amount per pupil. So that, for example, if the number of kids goes up, we receive additional funds for those students. Now, CPS has followed a hold harmless policy in recent years, so that if we fall a little bit below our projected enrollment, we do not lose any funds. But we have to make sure that we are staying as close as we can to our projected enrollment. If it grows a little bit, we have to take into account our space availability and the additional costs of having additional students. We do have limited space. Right now, really the maximum capacity of our school is about where we are now, with a little bit of growth potential. But we're not going to be able to grow in the way we grew between 2013 and 2018, for example. We've pretty well leveled off. But those budgets, the SBB funds, do not always cover all the costs for staffing. Each year there's an increase in personnel costs, and the SBB budget does not completely keep up with that growth. This can result in us utilizing internal accounts, as I mentioned before, and especially coming from rental income to support some of the positions that we have in the school. And these are essential positions. Jones operates on a pretty lean staffing basis. Our emphasis is on the classroom. The greatest amount of our funding for staffing and their salaries and benefits support our teachers and other direct instructional staff, our counseling teams, and so forth. Loss of rental income, however, since 2020, March of 2020, does pose a challenge for the school, as our enrollment programs and staff have not changed. So we've lost, at least for the last 13 months, a significant amount of income, but we are going to be, I'm hoping, able to make up some of that as the new school year begins next school year. We will see how that develops as we get a little bit closer to the school year. Next slide, please. We had some questions provided to us in advance, and I'd like to address those. First of all, one of the questions, and again, we can't get into a great deal of detail about this year's budget at this time, simply because we're still working through that. We have to submit our budget for fiscal year 22 by the 20th of May. So we have some time over the next few weeks. We'll be meeting with the LSC Budget Committee next week, and the following week we'll have our LSC meeting, at which time we'll present our proposed budget. Until that time, we have a lot of moving parts that we are working with and waiting to get some answers for a number of things. But I'd like to start off with just these few questions as a starter. One of the questions is, what changes do you foresee with regard to staffing for fiscal year 22? At this point, we foresee minimal changes. Always when there is a tight budget, we have to look at ways in which we can economize, ways in which we can realize some savings. This means maybe some shifting around of responsibilities. It may mean, for example, if we have retirements and resignations, as we do every year, the people who we hire as replacements may have a lower budget cost. Their salaries may be lower because they're further down on the salary schedule, for example. So we can realize savings in that way. We also, when we have open positions due to resignations and due to retirements and that type of thing, we have to assess whether we need to fill those positions or not. And that's an ongoing process. We may find that due to enrollment, due to course selections and so forth, it's not necessarily needed that we fill every one of those positions or fill them as full-time. They may be a half-time position, for example. So as I mentioned before, there are quite a few moving parts related to that, but we don't anticipate any really major staffing related changes. There will be some, however. Another question, what percentage of the freshman class for next year do we expect to be diverse learners, and will that impact staffing? As many of you may already know, CPS is going through a process to try to provide greater opportunity for students who have IEPs, students who are diverse learners, to have access to selective enrollment high schools. We do anticipate an increase in the upcoming freshman class with the number of students, pardon me, the number of students who have IEPs and are part of our diverse learner program. Now, this is our high incidence programming, not our cluster programs. Our cluster programs, severe and profound and moderate cognitive, will remain approximately the same as they are right now, and that is approximately 50 students. Their teachers and paraprofessionals are paid for through separate funding from CPS. But if we do see a significant increase in the number of students with IEPs, we will have to, number one, assess those numbers and what each of the students' IEP calls for in terms of services. We already know that we will receive at least one additional special education teacher, a resource teacher, and an additional case manager due to the numbers that we are anticipating. However, once we assess the individual students' IEPs, we know how many and what their needs are, we will be quite probably appealing for an additional special education teacher to support those programs, especially in our co-teaching and our resource room. So that's one area where we do anticipate we might be able to lodge an appeal that would give us additional staffing. The next question is, are we making any appeals? There are no appeals with regard to the student-based budgeting. It's based on the actual numbers. But as I mentioned, the appeal that we are potentially going to be doing would involve our staffing for special education. Do we project an increase in 10th day enrollment, which is an important measure as we do in the fall, for an increase in funding? And if yes, do we anticipate it to affect staffing? Every year, enrollment is used as a basis for determining whether additional funds are needed. As I mentioned before, CPS follows a policy that is called hold harmless. So if we fall below 1,970 students, no funds are taken away. However, if we come in higher than that, let's say, just as an illustration, we have 1,980 students enrolled and are present on the 10th day of school next fall. If that is the case, then we would receive additional funding based on that additional number. Now, for many years, we were able to grow our enrollment pretty dramatically, and that helped us with additional funds. However, in our situation now with our numbers and our capacity, our growth will be limited. Let's put it that way. So we will see what it brings us for our 10th day. Determining the number of incoming freshmen is let's put it this way, it's an inexact science. Invitations have to go out, and there's no real way of knowing how many will be accepted. So we obviously always invite more than we actually have seats for. Otherwise, we would fall short and have to go into multiple rounds. So when we get the numbers that are coming to us, hopefully tomorrow, we'll know how many people are being invited. There is a 2-week period for those students and their parents to make a decision. And then once that is in and we have our final numbers, we'll know what the size of the freshman class is going to be. And that is quite likely what will most influence whether we are at 1970 or somewhat above that. We also each year do provide an opportunity for students to transfer in at grades 10, 11, and 12. So there is a process for that, and we're undergoing that right now. But we have to limit the number of acceptances of transfers based on our capacity. So that's a very important factor. So the 10th day next year could bring, by the beginning of October, additional funds, or we might find ourselves right at 1970 or slightly below, and there would be no additional funds. Are there any positions not covered by SBB funding that you predict will need to be funded by internal accounts or FOJ funds? Internal accounts, yes, quite probably. They have for a number of years. It's usually been a relatively small number. During this current fiscal year, we had to go to a rainy day fund. I guess it's the best way to describe it. A number of years ago, when we were facing a major budget crisis, Friends of Jones launched a tremendous Bridge the Gap fundraiser. And that gave us a strategic reserve so that if we found ourselves in that situation, we would be able to bridge the gap. And we did that this year. So those funds have been used, and other internal accounts funds have been used during the current fiscal year to make sure we're covering all of our staffing needs. As we move forward, we're going to be looking toward how our internal accounts can grow again through our rentals and our leases. And if it is necessary to do additional fundraising, we will also investigate that as well. But I do anticipate that we'll be using 124 funds or internal accounts funds for staffing. There was also some additional funding, as I mentioned earlier, for next year to help students in this post-pandemic period. That may provide us with some opportunity to cover a staffing need for a position to focus on social emotional learning and restorative practices and other needs for our students. That remains to be seen because we have not yet received all the guidelines that we need for that. How will technology be funded as we move forward? We're going to be using existing funds that we have available to us. In addition, we are proposing for our student fees, some adjustments in the student fees, some reductions, but also the addition of a technology fee. We are moving toward one-to-one computing for our students, meaning each student currently does have a Chromebook assigned to them. Those that are here full-time and attending school in person, and those who checked out Chromebooks last year and this past fall for remote learning. However, we're going to be needing to purchase more. CPS was able to provide us with more than 1,000 Chromebooks, and we already had a good many, somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 or 700. Now we're going to need to purchase additional ones so that every student will have a Chromebook that they'll be able to check out every year and be part of the one-to-one computing. That means we will have need for funds to support the purchase of additional Chromebooks. Those will come from our internal accounts, largely from fees and potentially from other sources. And what is the plan for funding translations and interpreters? This has been an important topic in our LSC meetings in recent months. We are already moving in that direction and providing translation for a number of our documents and communications that go out. Some of these things can be done through online services. Others are going to require people within the school to actually provide direct interpreting or contracting for interpreting services for parent meetings and things of that sort. We will have a line item in our budget that will specifically address the needs of translation services and interpretation or interpreting during meetings. Now that concludes the questions that were sent in advance, and I would like to see if there were any others that came up through the forums. Mr. Hilbrands, were there any other quick questions or any themes? Okay, he is indicating at this time that there are no other questions. As we move forward, just in conclusion, I'd like to say some things about how we have in the past been able to manage our budgets. School budgets are always, every school year, every school, are always a challenge. Not only do we often find ourselves not getting quite enough of what we need, certainly through the actual formal budgeting, we also find ourselves having to make some tough decisions with regard to how we allocate the funds we have available to us. We have been very fortunate for a long time in our school. During at least 2 major rounds of serious budget cuts, back about 11, 12 years ago and about 4 or 5 years ago, we went through this. We have been able, through careful management, through fundraising, and through other means, we have been able to avoid major, in fact, even any significant cuts in our instructional staff. The maxim for school budget building or school business management is if you have to make reductions, you make them as far away from the classroom as possible. That means teachers. That means supplies and equipment. Now, teachers and all other personnel are the largest single part of any school budget. I truthfully, off the top of my head, I don't know what our percentage is. I would hazard a guess it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 to 95% of our budget is taken over or is encumbered by the personnel. Teaching in schools are very people intensive. Supplies, paper, things like that, yes, they cost money. Books cost money, but not anything compared to the cost of personnel. So we are going to be as economical as we can, and we have been. We are going to make any changes that we have to make to balance our budget and to meet our needs as far from the classroom as possible. That means that anything that we do will be calculated to have the least possible impact on our students, our programs, our teachers, in other words, our educational mission. So in the coming weeks, we'll be putting this all together. I want to thank our team here at Jones, our leadership team, our teachers, and our wonderful department chairs, our main office staff here, especially our business manager, Mr. Voigt, and Mr. Hilbrands, who handles so many other things for us here at school, and our terrific office staff. We owe a debt of gratitude to all these people because they're the ones who make this all happen for us. We've got to provide the resources, and we've got to make sure we do it in a way that has the greatest impact for the greatest good for the greatest percentage of our students. So thank you very much for tuning in. We appreciate your time and effort this evening. Thank you very much. Lots happening in the coming weeks, a lot more communications coming out regarding our seniors and our senior celebrations and many other things. So thank you and have a very nice evening.